So this is where we were. We said history is a reconstruction of the past based on the well-corroborated testimony of competent, reliable witnesses. So if I have to ask myself whether the book which John wrote, the Gospel according to John, is history, then I have to ask myself, is John competent to know what he is? Is he reliable as a witness? Then what he has written, can it be corroborated by evidence? And then, based on all this, we can accept what John has written as history, not otherwise. So do we have competent witnesses to the resurrection of Lazarus? Are these witnesses reliable? Can the witnesses' testimony be corroborated? Is what we would have to ask. We said, when it comes to a trial, the first thought that will be there on everyone's mind is the witness competent? Say this is an eyewitness who says that he saw it with his own eyes. Then we have a good quality witness here, competent to know the facts. Now you will observe he is wearing specs. So perhaps questions may be raised about whether he could actually properly, correctly see what he claims he saw. So maybe a medical test may be required. But however, the fact that he is a witness, an eyewitness, is very important. Such sources in history are called primary sources. Accounts written by eyewitnesses are called primary sources of information about anyone. Suppose this man were to say, I heard it from a colleague, then he is not an eyewitness. His colleague is the source of his information. Then he is referred to as a secondary source. Primary sources are excellent sources of information. Secondary sources are a little weaker. Sometimes in a court, this may not even be admissible as evidence. However, a historian deals with events that took place a long time ago and very often may use secondary sources to corroborate information that he obtains from primary sources. Sometimes the event may have taken place so long ago that the secondary sources, all that we have, under those conditions, it may be treated as a good source. But suppose the witness says, I heard it from my colleague, who heard it from his neighbor, then we would call this a tertiary source. In a court of law, this would not be admissible as evidence at all. However, the historian still uses tertiary sources. Sometimes the source of information is not even tertiary, but far removed from the actual events that have taken place. John, in his first epistle, now the word epistle simply means letter. I told you John wrote several letters. The first of his letters, I'm using the word epistle because that's often the word that is used for his work, the first epistle of John. Okay, so I'm using that same word. John, in his first epistle, says, that which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we have looked at, and our hands have touched, this we proclaim. We have seen it and testify to it. And we proclaim to you what we have seen and heard, so that you may also have fellowship with us. John is an excellent primary source. He is an eyewitness. He says, I have seen with my own eyes, I have heard with my own ears, my own hands have touched. He is talking about Lazarus. He is talking about Jesus, who raised Lazarus from the dead. So he is an excellent primary source. Luke was the author of another gospel known as the Gospel of Luke. In his introduction, this is what Luke writes. Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. With this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught. We can see that Luke is an excellent secondary source. And this is how he puts it. Many decided to write about Jesus. What did they write? They wrote what eyewitnesses told them. Okay. With this in mind, he says he carefully investigated everything from the beginning. Or in other words, Luke was not an eyewitness, but he met eyewitnesses and others. He investigated everything. He is an excellent secondary source. I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught. Okay. So you will notice John wrote an account of the life of Jesus. Luke wrote an account of the life of Jesus, but they both have different perspectives. What was Luke's perspective? Luke's perspective was that the reader will have an orderly account of the life of Jesus. And he will know the certainty of the things that he has been taught about Jesus. So if you want to know the life of Jesus chronologically, an orderly account, then Luke, by his own statement, is the best source for the life of Jesus. However, John's perspective is different. He is not so much bothered about writing an orderly account. He does not even talk about the birth of Jesus, his childhood. He wants to present Jesus as the Messiah, in whom people should put their trust so that they can have life. And in order to do that, he picks and chooses thematically. So it's not an orderly account. However, he proceeds to present Jesus as the Messiah, and he selects events from his life and the things he said, which will all add up to that. Okay, so his perspective is different. But you will notice Luke, who also writes about Martha and Mary, provides some, what shall we say, corroboration of the life of those sisters and the events that took place in their life. Simon Peter was another disciple of Jesus, contemporary, of course, with John and those two sisters and brother. And he wrote 2 letters. They are also a part of the New Testament. And the writings of John and Luke, together with the writings of Simon Peter, the writings of Matthew and Mark, who also wrote Gospels, and the writings of Paul and James and Jude, these give us a composite picture of the life of Jesus. And this is what Simon Peter says. We did not follow cleverly devised stories. Some would translate this as cunningly devised myths. When we told you about the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ in power, but we were eyewitnesses of his majesty. He received honor and glory from God the Father when the voice came to him from the majestic glory, saying, "This is my Son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased." We ourselves heard this voice that came from heaven when we were with him on the sacred mountain. Simon Peter is also a primary source for the life of Jesus and for the events that are recorded in the New Testament. Let's try to grasp the force of what we are saying. You know, in England, grandmothers would often tell stories to their grandchildren. And often this is what they would say: the moon is made of cheese. So many English children grew up believing that the moon is made of cheese. Now, is that true? Did this grandmother visit the moon? No. She's just talking. Someone who studies the moon with a telescope can have a better understanding of what the moon is like. But even that is limited. He may have a closer look because of his device, but it is still not hands-on. However, when we listen to Neil Armstrong, it's different. He was there on the moon. He walked on it. His hands handled moon dust and the rocks on the moon. In fact, he brought some back to the earth. So when he is talking about the moon, we know what he says is way more reliable than grandma and her moon made of cheese statement. What Armstrong says is way more reliable than the man who is only looking at the moon from afar with a telescope. Correct? So When we read about Jesus today, there are people who make statements like this. He was a myth. There was no real Jesus. Or he was a historical person, but just an ordinary human being. Some others say he was a great man, maybe a prophet. That's what our Muslim friends will say. Our Hindu friends may go beyond what our Muslim friends say, and they may refer to Jesus as an avatar, one of the many avatars. But these are people who never met Jesus. They are looking at him from afar. Is their opinion really very different from that grandma's opinion? I want you to think. John and Peter,
இல்ல இல்ல நான்
they
எங்க இருந்து
were-
கேக்குறேன் படி
they saw him with their own eyes. They heard him with their own ears. They touched him with their own hands. And they wrote about his life. Should we not rather go by what they have written? A second question that will be asked about a witness is it
கருது
reliable? Now, suppose this is a witness in that accident, and let us say he is father of the wrongdoer. How reliable is his witness? What if he is the father of the victim? How reliable will that be? So, while sifting through evidence, these are some things that a judge or jury will have to keep in mind. When it comes to the life of Jesus, how reliable were those who were witnesses to his life? John, people were upset with him because of what he wrote and said about Jesus. They tried to put him into boiling oil. And then later on, they banished him to a remote, rugged island, Patmos, which was a Roman penal colony. There he lived for many years before his release and death. Peter, because of what he said about Jesus, was crucified upside down. That's how he died. Would these men be relied upon to tell the truth? Yes. They were not saying what they said about Jesus, writing what they wrote about Jesus, because of anything that they could gain. In fact, they had everything to lose. So as witnesses, they were extremely reliable. Luke, the other person we mentioned, was hanged to death because he stubbornly insisted that Jesus was God in the flesh, that he was the Messiah. In fact, the entire New Testament was written in an atmosphere of intense persecution against the Christian community, a community of people who worshipped Jesus as God and who lived by his teachings. You can see over here a bunch of Christians thrown into the arena to be eaten by wild animals. There, in audience, are crowds of people screaming for their life. All around the ground, you can see crosses where some Christians have been crucified. They are covered in pitch, which will be set on fire to provide light so that the spectators will be able to see what is happening to these people. Oh, persecution was cruel in the Roman Empire. However, through all that persecution, those who preached about Jesus as God in the flesh wrote about Jesus the same way, did not waver in their testimony. They had everything to lose and nothing to gain by saying what they said. So, as witnesses to the life of Jesus and his deeds, they were very reliable. A third question we would like to ask is there corroborative evidence? Unlike fairy tales and other fictional accounts which may go long, long ago in a land far, far away, John, Luke talked about where and when the events they were referring to took place. John says it took place in Bethany. Bethany is a real place. In fact, today it's an Arab town called Al Azariah. Azariah? That's the Arab name for Lazarus. The name of the town means the town of Lazarus. Ah, it used to be known as Bethany, but today it is called Al Azariah, the town of Lazarus. In the town is a tomb that can be visited. A board above its entrance identifies it as the tomb of Lazarus. And this is where the man was buried. When it is open, you can enter the tomb and you can see what tombs back then were like. There were these niches that you can see into which bodies would be placed. This niche over here is pointed out too as the actual tomb of Lazarus. This is where his body was laid. And the locals will tell you that it was here that that 2000 years ago, Jesus called Lazarus by name. And Lazarus came out, still covered in his shroud. Is there corroborative evidence? Yes, there is. But at the tomb of Jesus, at the tomb of Lazarus, Jesus made other statements which are, to say the least, disturbing. Lord, Martha said to Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. You see, Jesus had by then acquired a track record of healing all kinds of illnesses. So Martha is confident if he had been around, her brother wouldn't have died. But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask. She considers him to be some prophet with a lot of influence with God. Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. Martha answered, I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. That was the Jewish belief. That one day all the dead will be raised to life. She said, I know he will rise again. Then Jesus continued, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live even though he dies. Aha. A person who believes in Jesus will have a particular type of life, and that life will continue even if he dies physically. Whoever lives and believes in me will never die. Okay. Do you believe this? John says he also made other scary statements. What kind of a man makes these statements? The notation that you see over here is abbreviated. JN is short for Gospel according to John. In the 8th chapter of his book, 58th and 59th verse, these chapters and verses are added to the Gospel of John to make reference easier. I tell you the truth, Jesus answered, before Abraham was born, I am. At this, they picked up stones to stone him. So there was this occasion when Jesus made this strange statement, I tell you the truth, before Abraham was born, I am. Now, this statement angered his audience. They picked up stones to stone him. Okay, now we may wonder why this is so. But perhaps we are thinking he should have said, from before Abraham was, I have been. That would be good grammar, right? Though that would be disturbing. Was this man really that old? But then that's not what he says. Before Abraham was born, I am. And do you think people pick up stones to stone someone because his grammar is not good? See, to the Jews, the I am brought to mind Moses. In their history, God chose Moses to lead them out of Egypt. And Moses asked God, I will go back to the people, but they will want to know, this God who appeared to you, what is his name? Because you see, in Egypt, where his people were slaves, many gods were worshipped. So Jewish history says God told Moses, tell them, I am sent you. I am is the name by which I am to be known among your people. And how we can understand when Jesus said before Abraham was, I am, I am. You see, Jews never said I am because they are pronouncing the name of God with their lips. So they carefully avoided saying the I am. So if I was a Jew and I lived back then, and if you walked up to me and asked me this question, are you Stanley Nelson? A simple answer would be I am. But then if I was a Jew, that's not what I will say, because I will be inadvertently taking the name of God on my lips, sinful lips. And even if I'm speaking a language other than the one in which God addressed Moses, it will still be a translation of the name of God. So as a Jew, I would not say that. I would rather say, your servant is Stanley Nelson. Not because I'm humble, but because I'm trying to avoid the I am. In fact, the Jews were so particular that when the Old Testament was copied, back then they didn't have printing presses, so they copied by hand. When the Old Testament was copied, whenever they came across the name of God, the scribe, the one who did the copying, would get up, have a bath, wear fresh clothes, come back, take fresh pen, take fresh ink, and write the name. Every time he came across the name of God, he would do that. In fact, the Hebrew of that time did not have vowels, only consonants. And since they would not pronounce it with their lips, over time they forgot what the vowels should be. So they knew the consonant should be Y, H, W, H, English equivalents I'm giving you. But they didn't know what the vowels should be. So they took the vowels of another name, Adonai, which means Lord, and incorporated it into YHWH and made it Yahovah, from which we get the English Jehovah, the anglicized form of the name of God. Today, of course, we know from a study of Semitic languages similar to ancient Hebrew that it was probably Yahweh. But why I'm saying this is the Jews were so particular about the name of God. So when Jesus said before Abraham was, I am, they were annoyed. What kind of a man uses the I am for himself? Is he saying he is God? On another occasion, he said, I and the Father are one. Again, the Jews picked up stones to stone him. You'll notice I'm picking all references from John's Gospel. Again, the Jews picked up stones to stone him. But Jesus said to them, I've shown you many miracles from the Father. For which of these do you stone me? We are not stoning you for any of these, replied the Jews, but for blasphemy, because you, a mere man, claim to be God. So when Jesus said, I and the Father are one, he did not mean that he and the Heavenly Father had the same view on some issue. If that was so, he would have clarified. However, he let that be because he meant what he said. And the Jews had understood correctly. If he was a mere human being, then what he said amounted to blasphemy. Matthew, another gospel writer, this is the gospel according to Matthew. When Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, who do people say the Son of Man is? Son of Man was a title Jesus often used for himself. They replied, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, still others Jeremiah, or one of the prophets. But what about you? He asked. Who do you say I am? You will observe, he does not say, who do you say the Son of Man is? But rather, who do you say I am? But a small thought over here. We would have thought he should ask the question, how do people receive my teaching? Do they agree with it? Do they want to live by it? No, he's more concerned about his identity. Okay, he says, who do people say I am? All that he said got Jesus into big trouble. He was arrested and he was tried. At the trial, the high priest asked him, are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One? Now, son of does not mean one fathered by. Okay. In Hebrew way of saying things, son of means one who has the same essential nature as. Are you the Christ, the one who has the same essential nature as God? I am. He doesn't say the Son of Man is, he says, I am. Said Jesus, you'll see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds in heaven. Oh, look at him talk. The high priest tore his clothes. Why do we need any more witnesses? He said. You have heard the blasphemy. What do you think? They all condemned him as worthy of death. Why? Because he called himself God. John writes about Jesus standing before the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate. You see the Jewish high priest in a meeting of the Sanhedrin, which was the highest Jewish religious court, passed the death sentence for blasphemy. But now they had no authority to execute him because only the Roman emperor or one of his governors acting on his behalf could pass the death sentence. John chapter 19, verses 6 to 9. Pilate answered, as for me, I find no basis for a charge against him after he had questioned Jesus. The Jews insisted, we have a law. According to that law, he must die because he claimed to be the Son of God, meaning he claimed to be one who had the same essential nature as God. When Pilate heard this, he was even more afraid, and he went back inside the palace. Where do you come from? He asked Jesus, but Jesus gave him no answer. So you will observe that the Gospels written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and the letters written by Paul and Peter and James and Jude very clearly present Jesus as one who clearly claimed to be God. So let's do a small analysis. His claim is either true or false. If it is false, there are two possibilities. Either he made this false claim knowingly, or he made it unknowingly. If he made it knowingly, that makes him a liar. If he made it unknowingly, then he is a lunatic. Correct? How can we know he is not a liar or a lunatic? If he is neither a liar nor a lunatic, then if what he says is true. On this note, we will take a second break. Over to you, Prabhakar.